Welcome to our Indie-stry chat. The members of Bloodhound Pix and an occasional guest give their no BS experiences with current aspects of the industry. Hi, and thank you for listening to this episode of Indie-stry, where I will be talking with Jessica Scott, a horror reviewer that we recently met through Twitter, a topic of conversation that we bring up quite constantly within this episode, talking about how it's helped bring the community together and help give a voice to others, but there's also the other side of that. It was a real pleasure talking with Jessica for this kind of first time, and we hope to have her back because she was great, and we go from things of gender all the way to what the future may bring, and it was exciting. So listen up and hope you enjoy. Thank you, Jessica, for joining us today.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited and a little nervous since it's my first ever podcast.
So I guess we could start off easy with, if you just kind of wanted to give our listeners a little bit of your history and kind of how you became a horror fan and just, your biography in general.
Gotcha. Honestly, I don't remember how I became a horror fan because I don't remember ever not being a horror fan. Yeah. Like, I grew up on horror TV, like Are You Afraid of the Dark I was obsessed with. And reading every horror book I could get my hands on, like Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark and John Bellairs, which introduced me to Edward Gorey and a lot of horror art. And I think the library, when I grew up, put a hold on a book that I just kept checking out over and over again about all the different types of ghosts and how to recognize them. And they're like, Jessica, you need to calm down and let somebody else read this book. So I have been obsessed with horror my whole life. I like I said, I really don't remember not being a horror fan. I've just always been obsessed with scary things and Halloween, and I kind of graduated from like Garfield's Halloween Adventure and the kind of the kid fair to the first like quote unquote big kid horror movie I remember seeing was Poltergeist. I hid behind the couch while my parents were watching it. They didn't know I was there, and it scared the hell out of me. So, but I was hooked from there. So I guess that's my horror origin story. Really was hiding out and watching Poltergeist in secret.
So what kind of inspired you to get into starting to write about horror? And I will get into it a little bit later, but initially, I know you were kind of saying you shifted more towards books, where it was but you also do movies as well. But
yeah. Well, honestly, I wanted to write when I was in high school and college, but I kind of shifted my focus and didn't end up doing anything remotely related to writing for a career. But I missed it a lot. And at the time when I started the blog, I think it was in 2017, I was married at the time and was always talking to my then husband, who was not a horror fan at all, about all these horror movies. And one day he said to me, I'm sorry, but I just do not care. Why don't you start a blog so you can get all this stuff out? Because I can tell you need an outlet for it. So why don't you write about it? And I thought, you know what, I will do that. So yeah, I started writing about movies. I didn't really know what I was doing. I look back and look at some of the older posts and just cringe, but I don't have the heart to delete them, honestly. But yes, I started writing about movies. And then about maybe a year later, I still really loved kids' books, especially scary kids' books. So I started a second blog where all I talk about is scary kids' books. And then I realized that I thought I was better at talking about books than I was at talking about movies. I wasn't very secure in my ability to talk about movies or my knowledge of like the mechanics of actually making a film. So I thought, well, I'll start doing stuff on my adult blog about books as well. So I had both of them running at the same time, and that's how I kind of switched gears a little, because I found the book blogging world was really, there was a lot of access to, a lot of really good books that I was really excited about reading, and I was getting good responses to the reviews that I was posting. So that's kind of why things shifted a little. But since then, I think it was probably earlier this year, I really missed talking about movies. And I started writing, some movie reviews on my blog, and then started looking primarily on Twitter for opportunities to write for other people and, get my work read and get my work edited so I could improve at it, So I reached out to Nightmarish Conjurings. Shane and McGrew over there put out a call for writers. I had been kind of looking for people who were willing to take on, less experienced people who didn't really have any connections or a whole lot of experience in the industry. And she's been really supportive and really helpful. So I started working for them, and I've been sending out pitches since then. So it's really exciting. It's really scary, but it's also it's something I've wanted to do for so long that I'm finally trying to start to do. So I'm really excited about it. But I still do the book reviews as well. So
this podcast kind of got started in the same way because the three of us were looking to do reviews as a group, and so we ended up doing the same thing, but through Ginger Nuts of Horror.
Yeah.
Where we kind of have the same, I guess, startup of, there's so many of these horror publications that are these big ones, but there is kind of that intimidation factor. It feels like, even though,
right.
most of these other sites or blogs or whatever, they're producing the same type of quality.
Mm-hmm.
But going back a little bit and talking about books, of that there is this weird element to it where for most of the population or people that are just kind of getting into the horror genre, there's this mentality that with like horror books, it's, Stephen King, Dean Koontz, whatever the main
right.
ones.
Yeah, like them, Clive Barker, like those are the three, yeah.
Are making a living, or at least, churning out a lot of books that most people don't really see. But so how do you find them, or is it one of those things where now they're searching out you specifically? And
well, it's kind of a combination of some people email me looking for a review, especially with the kids blog, because kids horror books is really a niche in the blogging world. So if somebody's got like a spooky kid story, a lot of times they'll come to me. Not everybody, obviously, because I'm not like some huge blogger, but sometimes people reach out to me saying, I'd really like to get a review for this book. Sometimes I look through Twitter because I follow a lot of authors and a lot of publishers. If anybody puts out a call like, hey, let me know if you want an advanced reader copy of this book, or if you want a copy of this already published book for review, let me know. And also, there are a few websites where you can get on if you want to get into book blogging, where you can set up a profile. One of them is called NetGalley, and the other one's called Edelweiss. And you can request books that way, and I've gotten a lot that way. And sometimes it's the major authors, the ones everybody's heard of, and a lot of times it's smaller ones from smaller presses, which is really exciting to me. Because, I'll probably get my horror card revoked. I have not read a lot of Stephen King, and I've never read anything by Dean Koontz, but I read a lot of indie authors, and they're some of the most interesting and most exciting authors to me. Not that Dean Koontz and Stephen King aren't, but I like finding the people that not everybody knows about, or that are just starting out. And I like being able to say, hey, I know you guys love, Carrie and Pet Cemetery, but check out this book also, because it might be up your alley,
Yeah. No, I guess I'll get mine revoked as well, because I think I've only read a couple Stephen King.
Yeah.
So I'm kind of in the same boat, and I know that is one of those strange, because over, in the States, he's, he is an amazing writer. I'm not saying it.
Oh, yeah, Oh, of course.
But I was listening to others talk from the UK or places like that, and they said that while they acknowledge that he's an amazing writer, because he talks so much about small town America and small town Maine, there's kind of that disconnect.
Oh, that makes sense. I can see that.
Yeah. And so I guess kind of going into the trying to think which way to take this out, because there is a topic. I'll wait on that one because that's
okay.
So going into kind of being an independent blogger and writer for kind of the modern era of horror, what has that been like for you? Because I know, and we're going to get into it in a second, but there is kind of a shift starting that because of several factors, especially pushed forward with COVID, but at least when you were first starting out, like with social media and with all of these.
Yeah, it's like Twitter is a real lifeline for me. Like, I see other people talking about upcoming books or movies, or things they're excited about, or I see creators promoting their work. So it's a good way to find, I don't want to say smaller, but a smaller press or a less well-known author than like the big giants of the industry. Like I said, social media is, obviously anybody who's on Twitter or anything else for any amount of time knows it's a double-edged sword. Like, you can meet a lot of friends and you can get a lot of good information, but if you doom scroll your whole day away or something, you're not going to get a lot done, and you might, especially with somebody who doesn't have a huge audience, sometimes it can feel like you're just shouting into the void. Yeah. Like, you want people to read or listen to or watch your content, and you want feedback, especially if it's good feedback. You don't necessarily want, bad comments, but sometimes it can feel like you're just out there doing your own thing and nobody really cares. But I know that, like, authors and filmmakers feel the same way. So I really enjoy being able to, read a book and say, hey, I don't see anybody else talking about this book, but it's amazing. You should pick it up. And the best thing ever is when somebody says, oh, I read this book based on your recommendation. It was so good. Or, oh, I'm going to pick this up now because this sounds really exciting. Yeah. So, yeah, I'm not sure if I answered your question or not.
No, but it's perfect. I think that kind of goes into a little bit because of this, like, especially with social media. This is, I guess, kind of where we're getting into the heavier portion of the interview, of this idea. And then, COVID really pushed it forward. But even before then, you have with the Me Too movement. And then, I've noticed, because I normally, for myself personally, I write more film-related blogs, even though I read horror. I'm actually kind of the opposite, where I always have little insecurities about writing reviews for prose.
Oh.
Yeah, but what I've been finding is that by reading all these different, on Twitter, all these different kind of sites that cover these books, that there is this movement going on where a lot of these smaller companies that may have had an author that was harassing other reviewers because they were, they gave a bad review or whatever the purpose was.
Yeah.
More people are kind of standing together and saying, okay, well, we're not going to review this person, or we're not going to no longer promote this whole publishing company's books, or things like that. So I think I'm kind of interested in hearing about, I guess, the shift, at least from the kind of book standpoint and from like running your own blog standpoint.
Yeah, that's another reason that I'm grateful in a lot of ways for Twitter, because especially if you are not necessarily one of the major sites or one of the major figures in the industry or the scene or whatever, sometimes you don't hear about things, especially, like you're talking about with Me Too. In pretty much every industry, there are all these whisper networks where, victims of harassment or assault, they don't feel like they have the power to speak up, but they talk to each other to try to protect each other. And I think moving toward a point where people, especially marginalized people, don't feel like they have to stay in those whisper networks, they can actually speak up and say something and people will support them. I think that's a good thing. And I'm glad to see people calling stuff out like that on Twitter, like saying, this author or this publisher or this actor or whoever has been mistreating people, they have assaulted people or harassed people, or they create a toxic work environment. I'm really thankful to the people who are brave enough to speak up, but I'm not casting any aspersions on people who don't speak up, because I understand that fear very much. But it's, especially, like, particularly in book blogging, there have been a couple of specific incidents really, really recently where, an author was harassing some reviewers. And I didn't have this experience with this author, so I'm not going to start naming names or anything because that's not my story to tell. But I'm glad that for the most part, the book community and the horror community have stood behind the people who were harassed and said, we're not going to support this company because they're not making amends to the victims.
Yeah.
And there are people in every industry who will take advantage or just act badly. But in this community, I think for the most part, we all want to support each other and protect each other and just, talk about horror, talk about things we like and not have to deal with, being harassed or feeling unsafe in that community that everybody's trying to build. I noticed that more kind of the Me Too adjacent issues in horror books, but that's where I'm spending all my time. So it may be happening the same everywhere, and I'm seeing what I'm seeing because that's the only place on Twitter that I really spend any time. And it's not just authors or publishing companies. There are people in every position who need to be called out. But I'm hopeful that we're getting to a point where the people who are speaking up and saying this happened to me aren't facing negative consequences. People are still getting harassed. Like, the people who are speaking up are still getting sock puppet accounts harassing them or getting all these DMs or whatever, But I'm hopeful that, if we keep speaking up and we keep saying, no, we're not going to put up with this. You're not going to harass this person. We stand with them. I'm hopeful that will start making a positive difference.
Oh, that's great, and I completely agree. So I guess what is kind of one of the topics that got this interview rolling that we can kind of move into is discussing gender and horror. Because I know you said that you kind of had a lot of thoughts on it, and it was something that really interests you. So I'd love to just go into that chatting.
Yeah, absolutely. I put out the call kind of like I hear all these great podcasts. I really like to appear on one. And when I'm watching movies or reading books, the things that always pop out to me, or usually do, are, gender relations or how horror explores gender and sexuality. So it's something I like talking about just because that's one of my biggest interests, and one of the things that always jumps out at me, kind of talking about how the industry is changing. I was looking some stuff up because I wanted to have a timeline in my head before we had this conversation, because it feels like so many things today, both in horror literature and in horror film and TV, the things I'm most excited about are projects from women. Like in film, like Nia DaCosta directing Candyman. I'm so excited about that. Who knows when that'll come out or when we'll ever be in a theater again. But hopefully, everybody will get to see that soon. And like Misha Green, the showrunner on Lovecraft Country, I don't know if you've seen that yet, but that first episode was amazing. And it's so good.
Currently in a very rural area until the end of the month, and then I get to go back and watch it.
Yeah. Well, I hope you'll love it. I really loved the first episode. And I've heard from pretty much everybody who's reviewed it that episode 5 is just the best thing they've ever seen. So I can't wait for 4 or 5 weeks from now when that airs. But yeah, and I was looking up, trying to make sure my mind wouldn't go blank when we were talking. So I looked up some of my female directors that I like, and I remembered about 2 years ago when Jason Blum had that infamous quote about, there aren't a whole lot of female directors out there, and and very few of those want to do horror, and then everybody jumped on him immediately, and he apologized for it. But I feel like there's been, I don't know if it was in, partly due to that, that conversation turning, but it feels like there's been a bigger focus on women leading horror, like focusing on women directors and, you know, like, I think women have always been at the forefront of the genre, at least as actors, because nobody talks about Scream Kings. They just talk about Scream Queens, you know. But there's not much of an acknowledgement that women are such leaders in horror. But it feels like that is changing to me. I'm not usually a rosy person, but I may have my rose-colored glasses on for that. But it feels like it's changing. It feels like the conversation's changing, with women getting more opportunities and being boosted more, especially women of color. Like I mentioned, Nia DaCosta and Nisha Green. So
it's interesting the way you're talking about it, because was it when, you know, there's that whole history too of that for the longest time it was viewed as horror is this in the same style as that how they viewed comic books, where it's like only for young men type of thing. Well, that's the audience. And you know, then you see, what was it, the slashes of the 70s and the film like Maniac, and you know, you had all these people coming out saying how awful it was, and you know, because of that they ended up shifting where slashers became more supernatural and less realistic. But they're finding, when actually looking at it, I think this was on History of Horror, it's been talked about a bunch, but that there were more women in the audience for films like that than there were men.
Yeah, absolutely.
And yeah, I always think it is one of those kind of interesting conversations that same with, you know, people of color. It's, you know, where, you know, all of these things are always seen as like, oh, it's just young white men are the only audience member, and that's who they market to for decades. But you actually see, no, they're actually, in a lot of cases, they're in the minority themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I'm a huge comic book fan too, so I've experienced that in horror and in comics. But, you know, I know so many people who aren't straight white men who are fans of comics and fans of horror. And like the vast majority of my friends are horror fans or women. I can't speak for anybody but myself. I think part of, I wrote about this recently in a piece on my blog about the movie Haunt. It was on Shudder. I don't know if you've seen that one.
I didn't get to watch all of it, but
gotcha. Yeah, I really loved that one. But part of a lot of what I enjoy about horror, you know, I love gore. I love a good slasher. I like a good kill as much as anybody. But also, a lot of times it helps me kind of exercise my fears in a safe environment. And not only are some slashers more feminist than I think some people give them credit for. Not all of them, obviously. I'm not going to defend every slasher out there as, you know, secretly feminist. But I think for some women, it's a way to kind of exercise fear of violence in a world dominated by men in a safe, fun way, especially with, you know, seeing all these final girls who are heroes to a lot of people, you know, Laurie Strode, you know, Nancy from Nightmare on Elm Street, you know, Sydney from the Scream series. Like, so many people look up to those women as heroes, you know, because they're survivors. And I think there are a lot of survivors of all different kinds in the horror audience. Like I said, I can't speak for anybody else. I'm not going to ascribe any, you know, psychological significance to every single horror fan out there, but I think that plays into it a lot, though.
Well, I think it's kind of this interesting topic, and I'm glad that a lot of this, you know, especially, you know, we've touched on social media a lot, and I think that's kind of really helped kind of bring a lot of this to the light.
Yeah, because so many people are talking about it together and saying, oh, I had the exact same experience. I didn't realize someone felt the same way.
Exactly. And so, because we talked on it, you mentioned it briefly, and so it's been on my mind, and we've been hinting at it little bits here and there, so it's changing subjects a little bit, but not fully. But talking about the future of horror and the industry, and especially, you know, the elephant in the room, obviously, is with everything that's happened in 2020. COVID, you have, you know, the election, you have just a slew of things that, you know, when you talk to people a lot of times, especially for me doing this with people in the film industry portion of it, they really look at it as there's either the response of that, theaters will reopen, but they'll basically be for big event or movies or tentpole movies, and then everything else will go to online, and that's been something that has been slowly transitioning to anyways. It just pushed it forward quickly, or things like that. And yeah, I'd love to hear kind of what your thoughts are on moving forward, and if we've kind of passed a point of no return, I guess, for the industry portion of it, and then how the genre you think will move forward as a storytelling.
Yeah, honestly, I'm really interested to see that myself. Like when COVID first started, everybody, especially I heard this in book circles, everybody was like, "Well, here come the pandemic stories." Yeah. Everybody was thinking, because obviously horror reflects, our modern fears, and pandemic stories have always been pretty popular, but right now they're obviously very relevant. I like the idea that we'll move even further into VOD being, first run for a lot of movies, just because it's so much easier for people, whether it's financially or if you're disabled and you can't get to the theater very easily. I think it opens up a lot of access for people. I can't speak to the financial aspect, I think that's why, New Mutants, which has been delayed for 4 years, they keep saying they're going to open at the end of this month, and I don't know why they won't just go VOD, because I think a lot of people would pay a lot of money to see it right now. But so I think there are some studios still holding on to that tentpole idea, they think the industry is going to stay with the MCU model, where you have midnight showings where you sell out the theater. But I don't know that's not feasible right now, because it's not safe to congregate in huge groups. Obviously, well, not obviously, because some people don't like the theater, but a lot of people miss that communal theater experience. I know I've always enjoyed seeing horror movies with a big group of people. But I would love to see more access and more VOD for everything, not just for new releases. I would love to see back catalogs opened up, just to kind of break down the walls of access for people who don't live in a major city and they can't get to a festival or a limited run engagement for some indie movie. But as far as storytelling, the immediate effects, I'm not sure how it's going to work. I obviously Host, I thought was brilliant, but not everybody is going to be able to make a Zoom movie and make it fresh and interesting, and not everybody can pull that off. And I've heard about some movies. I think a Zack Snyder, excuse me, I can't talk right now. A Zack Snyder movie where he's recast an actor and will just be doing reshoots with green screen and CGI. I kind of selfishly hope we don't go to the point where actors are filming in separate locations and they're CGIing 20 people into a room together. Just frankly, there's something very creepy to me about that. But if that works, then that's the way we're going to have to do it to keep everybody safe, making movies and stuff. But I do expect to see a lot of, maybe not direct, pandemic stories, but that kind of fear of other people seeping in specific 2020 ways. Kind of maybe a return to the paranoia of the late 70s.
I actually read, I can't remember if I read about it or heard it on another podcast where they were talking about that, saying that they were thinking that it would, instead of being a zombie type movies, it would go towards more Invasion of the Body Snatchers.
Exactly. Yeah, that's the movie I had in my mind, that sense of you can't trust anybody, you can't be around anybody, which, that's one of my favorite movies ever, and that's a vibe that really resonates with me, especially this year when, everything is in utter chaos and you feel like you can't leave your house. It's not safe to go anywhere. I mean, that's a theme that I think people will be able to explore really well. And you asked about like George Floyd and Black Lives Matter, finally gaining a little bit of traction and getting a little more attention. I'm hopeful that I was talking earlier about how I feel like especially Black women creators are getting more opportunities maybe or more notice. Like with Lovecraft Country, that's a brilliant story about racism, especially in Jim Crow America. And exploring stories like that where the scariest thing isn't the supernatural monsters, it's, the horrible things that Black people and other marginalized people have had to go through. I'm excited to see stories like that and to see them get a lot of notice and get a lot of attention. So I think, and I'd be interested to see a kind of combination of those things where a Black filmmaker tells a story about the paranoia we were discussing, like kind of Invasion of the Body Snatchers, because the whole idea of you can't trust your own body, you don't know who's who, you don't know who you can trust. That's obviously something that a lot of people can relate to, but especially not knowing who you can trust as a Black American, not knowing, what white person is safe to be around. Those are things that I'd really be interested to see explored.
Yeah, I am very kind of grateful to start seeing these this diversity in kind of the storytelling, because we're also getting, I think, new or fresh approaches. I know it's been an argument that I've had, and a peaceful one at that, but with some of the horror community of, there was a slew of, where you either get something that's witch related, but it takes place in New England based on, Christian themes and so on and so forth. And it was kind of, for me, like, I could notice really good ones, there's the witch, things like that, but then also I'd love to see a different approach that isn't, the Salem based,
Yes, yeah. Like yeah, absolutely. And like, there's so much to explore, like you said, not just timeline wise, but like culturally. Like, it's not just, white witches in the 16th, 15th, 16th century dress, speaking with an English accent. There are modern witches. There are witches from all over the world. And you can tell so many interesting stories, especially where the witches are not the villains. Obviously a lot of stories like The Witch, I've heard that Eggers takes issue, I may be incorrect on this, but that he takes issue with people seeing it as a story of empowerment against, evil Christianity. But for the most part, I think a lot of movies do portray witches as villains, and I'd love to see them, maybe as the heroes or something more nuanced than just villain or hero,
I have an interesting topic to discuss is this idea of, especially in horror lately, there's this feeling, and I've talked about it a lot, but where a hero needs to be, where it seems like there is this shift of, certain filmmakers or storytellers or whoever they are, maybe it's coming from the fans themselves, probably more so, of wanting it to be this black and white, where you have the hero is good and whatever, and then the villain is
right,
villain and bad, and whatever, where you can have, a quote unquote likable character that is also a villain. Likable means is more it means compelling than somebody you agree with, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, a lot of times, sometimes the hero, quote unquote, is the boring one. Everybody identifies with the villain. But yeah, I mean, since horror explores so much about, what lies below the surface and the things that scare us the most, there should be a lot of nuance, and there should be stories where nobody's the hero because nobody maybe is capable of being a hero in a horrifying world, Like, there should be ways to explore, people doing bad things and not necessarily being the villain, or like I said, I really like movies where there is no hero, where there are just different shades of darkness, and it's just examining the possibility in human nature to do what you need to survive sometimes. That's a big aspect in horror as well.
So, going back a little bit, I guess, to some of these topics of race and talking about Lovecraft Country and all that, I know that's been a big thing that I've been reading about, especially with reviews on this show, or the joke that's been made is, well, now you're going to get, how do they phrase it, out of the woodworks, you're going to get all the people trying to defend Lovecraft racism and say that, oh, he was just, everybody was racist at that time, or stuff like that. So, I'd love to hear you, if you want to talk about.
Yeah. Well, first of all, for anybody listening, I'm white, so take everything I say with a grain of salt. Like, if you want to hear about what people have to say about Lovecraft Country or Lovecraft in general, I would recommend you go listen to a black critic. So I want to have that caveat out there right now. But even, obviously I take issue with, oh, well, that's just how people were at the time. No, racism is racism, no matter what year it was. But even for the time, people recognized how racist Lovecraft was. Yeah. It's pretty monstrous, to be honest with you. I've seen a lot of people trying to reclaim, or that might not be the right word, but kind of rename Lovecraftian horror as cosmic horror. Yeah. Because he wasn't the only person to write in that vein, the fear of the cosmic unknown. Yeah. And he wasn't the first person. He may be the most famous. But it's not something that he owns by virtue of, he wrote, Mountains of Madness, so this is Lovecraftian horror. No. So, if you can acknowledge, like, I read this book of his, and I like this approach that he took in terms of this gnawing feeling of just being such a small speck in such a big, possibly malevolent universe. But you have to acknowledge that even the core of some of his stories was rooted in racism. Yeah. I've enjoyed seeing some of the takes, like, I know Lovecraft is rolling in his grave right now after Lovecraft Country aired, because, it's about, lifting up Black voices and Black people and showing how horrible and terrifying racism was and continues to be. It's taking kind of a theme that Lovecraft was fond of and using it to point out everything that was wrong with the man, sort of. Not that that's all that the show is about, but so I really enjoyed seeing so many people respond to it that way. And again, I can't speak for anybody else, and I especially can't speak for a Black critic or a Black viewer. I always want to hear more voices and learn about things that aren't my experience. Yeah. Because there were moments in the show where I'm ashamed to say I was shocked, because it's one thing to know intellectually about something, and it's another thing to watch it happen, and to watch it happen to a character that you care about. And I have a massive amount of privilege that I've never had to watch, racist violence against somebody in my family because my family's white. I'm sure a lot of the things in the show weren't as shocking to people who grew up with it or have family members who grew up with it. But I think that's an important part of the show. In addition to being just really brilliant and really entertaining, it also shows some privileged people, like, this is the country, from people in the United States, this is the country you grew up in, this is the country that your parents grew up in, you have to face this past, and we have to do something to fix it moving forward,
I agree, and I think, that's a great way to kind of put it, is that there is this mentality sometimes, especially in the state of, it's in the past, and so it's no longer our problem.
Right.
It was, or I wasn't the one that did it, type of thing. So it's
right.
And I think something that should still be addressed and should still be. You didn't have to do it to be to still. I don't know if it's take ownership, but take understand the responsibility or understand that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, the past informs the present, it informs the future, and if you just abdicate responsibility like that, then you are the problem,
Going back a little bit, and then, because Lovecraft, it was originally called, was it Weird Fiction, I think, or something, because there are, even though I don't think there's really been any major works of his, there's adapted, there's Algernon Blackwood, there are a series of these other authors that came out during that time, but just kind of, it's all become Lovecraft.
Right, yeah, everybody uses it as the shorthand, but I like cosmic horror because it places a sense of scale to it, because that sense of, I'm a tiny plaything for the universe and I have no control. I just like that it immediately gives you that sense of awe and horror.
It makes more sense to me, I've always felt, because there are some stories that don't necessarily... They're definitely cosmic horror, but I would never say that they're Lovecraftian in their approach.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And so, going a little bit, and because I don't think I've really talk about your blog more so, because we've mentioned that you do it, but if you kind of give the name and so people can find you and kind of all that self.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, all my promos. So my name on Twitter is We Who Walk Here, and that's the name of the blog as well. It's wewhowalkhere.blog, and I do lately pretty much a mixture of book reviews and movie reviews, sometimes like a full movie review, and sometimes a list of, like, I watched these 20 movies last month, and here's a tiny little review of what I thought about each one of them. And I also write for some other sites. I've got links on my Twitter account, and I always post those and retweet those, and try to support other writers on those sites as well, because there are a lot of amazing writers out there. And also the kids book blog is spookykidlit.com, and that's pretty much all book reviews. It's like, I know this sounds silly, but it's horror books from ages 0 to 18, and there are, scary books for babies out there. So, but yeah, and I'm primarily write for nightmarishconjurings.com. I do a lot of work there. I'm, working on some other stuff. I just had a piece published on Film Cred a day or two ago. So like I said, you can find links to all that on my Twitter page.
I forgot to talk about kind of learning more about children or spooky children's books. So before we go into that, is there, or just for the sake of this podcast, where a lot of times we talk about kind of independent, obscure horror cinema, and it doesn't have to be cinema, it can be a book, it can be anything, but is there any kind of obscure works that you really champion and wish?
I don't know how obscure it is. I've got a couple of answers. As far as books go, whenever anybody asks me for a horror book recommendation, I always say Come Closer by Sarah Gran. It's a novella. I read really slowly, and I think it took me less than an hour to read it. So, but it is the scariest possession story I've ever read. It's about a woman who becomes possessed by a demon, and going back to our talk about gender, it really explores through the narrative of a possession how she loses herself in her marriage and how she loses her sense of identity. And it's really good. It's really terrifying. The first time I read it, I hid under the blankets with all the lights in the house on. So I highly recommend it if you want something scary and if you want something fast but thought provoking. And as far as movies, I don't know how obscure it is, but I could talk for hours about Terror Vision. It is one of my favorite movies. I think it's a lot better than most people give it credit for. It's usually mentioned in like, oh, it's so bad it's good, but no, it's just good. So if you haven't seen it, to anybody listening, I highly recommend you check it out. I think 1986 is when it came out. The less you know, the better. Just go in and watch it and enjoy all the craziness.
I'd love to hear, because like you said before, it is kind of a niche of scary stories for children, 0 to 18.
Yeah.
When I was growing up, it was there's scary stories to tell in the dark. Wasn't it?
Yeah.
That was it. Then your Goosebumps.
Right.
And I grew up, I'm from Michigan, so we had the Michigan Chillers, or something, which were basically like a Goosebump knockoff. But I'd love to hear more about that portion of the book world.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So, like I said, I cover everything for ages 0 to 18. So, like, from like board books or picture books all the way up to young adult. There are a lot of really, people aren't writing bloody slasher stories for babies, but there are, in the older age ranges, there are some really scary books and some really quality books out there right now, and have been for some time. Like I said, when I was growing up, it was, scary stories to tell in the dark. I read a lot of John Bellairs, but there are a lot of really great ghost stories, especially in middle grade, which is like ages 8 to 12. And to an adult, I'm sure you're thinking, oh, that sounds like torture. That sounds really dumb. But there are some amazing books out there. And there are, especially in YA and young adult, there are some, really scary, really funny, really smart books. There's a book coming out, I want to say next week, called Clown in a Cornfield, which is a YA book. It's a total, love letter to slashers. But it's also got a really smart political bent to it. If you want to get into maybe younger horror, I think that's a good gateway because it satisfies the urge for blood and gore, but it's also, for a younger audience. But yeah, I'm trying to think of some others to recommend, but there's so much out there that even I haven't been able to keep up with because, children's book authors and young adult authors, they cover a lot of the things that horror covers, universal fears, universal experiences, fear of growing up, fear of loss. There's a lot of dealing with grief and things like that. And some of them are really political, like a lot of horror is really political. I think kids' books get kind of a bad rap a lot of times. People look down on them a little bit, or they look down on adults who read kids' books. But there's so much quality horror out there in the kids' books world.
You have people talking about horror and that horror is only effective if it's rated R and stuff like that. It's kind of a argument that I think is then you haven't seen the right stuff or you haven't read the right.
Exactly, yeah. Because you can have a movie with no nudity, no gore, no blood, and it's the scariest thing ever. Like The Haunting, the original Haunting, is probably my favorite horror movie, and it's all suggestion. It's all, sound design, and it's terrifying. You can do a lot with a very little, and without going for NC-17 to shock people. Not that there's anything wrong with that. I like a good NC-17 movie, but you know what I mean.
This has been a great chat, and I think I've learned a lot about kind of the book world and just horror in general, and I'll definitely check out Lovecraft Country, and then when I'm able to finally. But yeah, it's been a real pleasure chatting with you, Jessica.
Likewise, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
And if you ever want to come back on and do a whole episode on Terror Vision or anything else, feel free to.
Awesome. I would love it, honestly.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bloodhound Pix podcast is part of the Morbidly Beautiful podcast network. Produced by Josh Lee, Craig Drum, and Kyle Hintz. Music by Raymond Seed. Editing by Kyle Hintz.